Hello and welcome everybody, I'm Barbarian and this is Victoria 3's Dev Diary number 33, Decentralized Nations. I hope that everything sound-wise and recording-wise is alright. I reset my computer and man, this really means that we are in the future now, because honestly, restoring everything, setting everything up took me at best like half an hour or something. I remember it taking days. Now what isn't going to take days is this Dev Diary, because it is pretty short. And slowly but surely, even I am falling into this sort of loop where I'm saying, hey, wait a minute, maybe these are filler dev diaries, maybe we have this stuff, then we have trade, and then we already are looking towards release. I'm not sure. I can tell you though that this is an interesting dev diary, but again, not exactly filled with mechanics. Now, let's jump into it, and first things first, we got a bunch of nostalgia here. Listen, if you played Victoria Revolutions, I mean, honestly, this color is so iconic for the Ottomans right here. This color also was in Hearts of Iron 2 Doomsday, for example, for Turkey, right? And it is just incredible. I remember the Persia color as well, the Ethiopia, my god. What a decision to make. But this is Africa in Victoria Revolutions, and as you can see, my god, the provinces were of a different quality. The provinces in Victoria Revolutions were of a different quality. I love the Gibraltar right there. Now what has to be said about this sort of map is that of course it is incredibly empty, and this is sort of also the point. This dev diary is written by Overloaf. You may have heard of Overloaf, the original creator of After the End. And you can see that this is a very easy depiction of Africa, let's say it like this, because basically it only exists so that you can colonize it. That is the only purpose, and the colonization in itself is not exactly engaging. Victoria Revolutions, of course, was the first of its kind. You have to take a look at this and say, you know what, you can get away with that because this is where you try things. This is where you have mechanics that you've never experimented with. But at the end of the day, I gotta tell you, this Africa looks just as sad and, you know, basically empty as, well, the gameplay of colonization also felt. Now here we have what Overloaf has to say about this. Above is Africa as it was represented in Victoria Revolutions. Most of the continent is open territory for any great power to colonize. There's people living there, but they don't do anything. Outside of a few limited cases like Sokoto, they are represented by literally nothing. They do not do anything on their own, and when added to a colonizing power, they just immediately become pawns in the imperial game and don't really care for independence or their own homeland. Yeah, it was quite static, of course. You have to really look at this from this point of view, and obviously from a modern point of view, it's entirely correct. It is a bad gameplay loop, it is a bad basic design choice, but back in the day, getting to the point where colonization even is something that you can do, where it even works properly, that was tremendous. So I do want to recognize that, of course. That was a big step. Now here we have, honestly, a much better looking Africa, just aesthetically pleasing, speaking from that angle. Just look at the difference between these two. You can see Morocco. Oh my god, the shape of North Africa changed so much. And I actually love as well that in many of these older games, you had Malta right in the front of the coast of Libya, when it actually is, of course, so far away. This was just the old projection that they used, but you can see that in the details, things didn't really change. Africa is still very much empty, still very much exists, so, you know, to be colonized, and then that is that. And the reason for that is, of course, that Victoria 2, when it launched, before A Heart of Darkness came out, Victoria 2 also wasn't really too keen to do anything about colonization. Later on, it would be a process that could lead to the crisis system, which is really, really cool, and that is the basis, of course, of what Victoria 3 will then also be doing. We're gonna get to that in a second. The same is broadly true in Victoria 2. Regions historically colonized by imperial powers such as most of Africa and parts of the Americas are represented as unclaimed swaths of land, just waiting for an empire to come by and colonize them. The people who live there do not care who marches in and will just be members of one empire or another forevermore after they are colonized. It's a model that could use some improvement. It didn't do justice to the people who historically lived there, and frankly, it made colonial gameplay kind of boring. Yes, Victoria 2, after A Heart of Darkness came out, of course, was much more interesting when it comes to colonization than Victoria 1, but that doesn't really mean too much because Victoria 1 was incredibly boring. But yeah, at the end of the day, it didn't really do much. There was not much interaction there. It was all very much just you claiming aesthetic borders, right? It wasn't really about the topic of, okay, can I deal with this decentralized country, for example? Can I interact with these people without causing a crisis that then may lead to a situation where other people get involved? No, this one exclusively cared whether you and somebody else were colonizing it at the same time, because if you were, that could spark a crisis. The actual population had no impact whatsoever. Now, all of this changes in Victoria 3, and let's just compare the shape of Africa here. No, yeah, Victoria 3, I mean, honestly, Victoria 2 did a lot right when it comes to the shape, but Victoria 3 also, yet again, very appropriate when it comes to the shape. You can see greater details over here in the west. I mean, this is just a couple of islands right here, right? Look at those 4, and then you have much more detail right there in how these islands are actually shaped, so you can see the increase, of course, in detail, and most importantly, Africa isn't actually empty. You have way more centralized, although unrecognized nations, Wadai, Darfur, right? We have a split Ethiopia rather than Ethiopia just existing as it was, right? We have all of these newly centralized nations that, of course, was decided during the development process, and then we have the undecentralized, we have the decentralized nations that make it so that you actually interact with somebody when colonizing, meaning that there isn't just the relationship between you and different colonizers, but also between you and the colonized, which previously was completely ignored right here. That should add a lot. I will also say, I think it is a good choice that as it stands, that the team has decided that it is not a priority to make decentralized countries into playable countries. Right now, they are off limits. You can't play them, right? Just to make that clear, it's not possible to play them. But I hope that they do eventually move towards that, because a gameplay loop that isn't just, for example, Japan, you know, moving on and becoming recognized, but that is much, much further when it comes to organizing a state to begin with, when it comes to organizing central authority and central power, and then having industrialization and such happen, that could be very interesting. Of course, you already have Sokoto and whatnot, so you can already jump in and check it out. You have the Zulu, that will be very interesting, I think, of a campaign to play. But yeah, basically, the idea here is that they are decentralized, they can't be played, but they will give you another layer. Let's take a look at what Ophelov has to say in this regard. In Victoria 3, decentralized nations exist to address both the issues of gameplay and better representation of indigenous peoples. No matter where an empire tries to colonize, someone already lives there. They're organized, although they don't have the same level of international recognition and administrative organization as, say, the Congress of Vienna attendees. No formal declaration of war needs to be made in order to make an incursion into the territories of decentralized nations and start colonizing. Although the deeper you colonize into a decentralized nation's lands, the more likely it is a diplomatic play will kick off, where the decentralized nation starts a real war of resistance against you. This is important. First of all, they will start a war, meaning that you need to be able to commit troops to this region, or you will have to leave your colonies. This is a big part, and this is a big aspect. You can't just colonize and not have any troops. You need at least some troops that can defend your colonies should this happen. But more importantly, this is the diplomatic crisis as we had it in Victoria 2, where you would have a crisis system, and then if you colonize something together and you both don't want to give up, this can spark a crisis, and so on and so forth. But it is much more flexible now, because it is now inherently triggered if you basically antagonize the decentralized nation too much, if there is an adversary that wants to be involved, that has a strategic interest declared in this region, or, well, not declared necessarily, it could just be that they hold territory there to begin with, they can immediately spark a war there as well. A major war. It's no longer just, you know, hey, you trying to get rid of the resistance in the colonies. No, it is you needing to fight an actual major power that wants to stop you to colonize to begin with. That is a really good aspect. I think this is the normal evolution. I think we talked about this as well when we talked about colonization, and this actually being something that originates from the natives makes it so that you really now actually have an interaction with them, which again previously was not the case at all. Even if a colony is successfully established, the people living there aren't just pawns. They'll remember that they weren't always colonized subjects, and just like any other part of an empire, they'll agitate for independence if conditions are right. I would really like, oh man, I hope, I really do, that there is some sort of gameplay loop. Let's say I'm Sokoto, right? And I obviously have colonial neighbors. I have people like France, like Germany, like Spain, like Great Britain, and so on, that have created colonies here in my neighborhood. Could I potentially spark unrest? Obviously, you could, as Sokoto, get involved during the colonization process. That is exactly what these diplomatic plays are there for. So, for example, if somebody colonizes Igbo right here, then Sokoto could get involved if a diplomatic crisis were to be sparked. But I'm thinking, let's say all of these are already colonized. Could I get these pops to agitate an anti-colonialist sentiment. Maybe it won't be successful in the early half of the year, because that is, of course, when these colonial empires thrived, when they were very eager to be established, but especially in Britain, for example, in France as well, there was a certain wariness once we came to after the World War I, right? Meaning that might be where Sokoto can spark something. Maybe you even have an international communist rebellion. I mean, this was, of course, one of the huge proxy areas also for the World War II, for the Cold War, right? So I would be very excited if we have something going there. Obviously, these pops already remember. This is what they are making clear here. They remember that they weren't always part of this empire, but I do wonder whether I can get involved from the outside here. That would be pretty cool. Now let's keep reading. Mapping these nations has been a challenge. We essentially started with the Victoria 2 map as a base to build off of, which meant we had a lot of work to do, just gathering information for peoples across the globe. Records of who lived where and how many people lived there have been difficult to obtain for some regions. This is a huge issue because, insultingly, nobody at the time, whether that is the actual natives or whether that is the colonizing powers, really care to get records that are for us in the future, right? That was not really relevant for them for history's purposes, so there is a lot of difficulty in there. Let's look at North America for an example of the process. So this is the snippet of a beautiful draft image used when presenting the original proposal. First of all, I think this is the first time that we're actually seeing individual provinces mapped out properly. Obviously, you can see them in the war interfaces, right? And just look at this, by the way. This is also a war interface, and I believe this is an ongoing war, or at least it looks like one. Here we have different tribes, of course, and there is something that has to be said to this. This is part of one drafted proposal for the implementation of decentralized nations in North America. There's already some compromise in this version. Peoples have been consolidated into some larger polities, and some state borders have been followed largely because having just one or two provinces on the other side of a state line can create regions too small to provide anything or anybody. This is not market related, just to point that out. That is a completely different issue. This is related to the fact that the units that we act upon here, and the units that we acted upon in Victoria 2, were always state-sized. And if somebody lives in a state that is tiny, where nothing is there, they will only be able to work in this very state, even if one province over, right? There would be a huge job opportunity. They would have to completely migrate. Again, same for Victoria 2, of course. Now, the thing about that is that what they decided here, and this is what they just said here, is that sometimes they would have a situation where, you know, hey, in one or two states, there were just 3 or 4 provinces technically taken by, for example, some of the Native American, polities that they created here, right? And that doesn't really work, because gameplay-wise, that is as though they didn't have that state. So instead, they would probably move the pops over there, you know, hand that over to the other state that is just next door, so that it can be one consolidated state. That makes a lot of sense to me personally, at the very least. Right, where were we? 400 pops living in State X aren't able to provide enough men to contribute a single battalion to a native uprising, among other things. So basically, they would just not be gameplay relevant, and that's just not... You can't have systems just to have it. It needs to make sense, and gameplay-wise, obviously, that doesn't. The design isn't just for the decentralized nations, it is something we also do elsewhere in the world when trying to balance historical accuracy with gameplay, although we of course try to avoid steering too far from actual history. And then this is the actual outcome. I think we can see a lot of consolidation here. Actually, I mean, yeah, there are some smaller, there are some others right here. We have a larger one here, and ultimately it amounted to this. Interesting to see. We have the Iron Confederacy up there. I assume, right, at least this is the way I see this, I would assume that, for example, the Iron Confederacy, the Cree, right? Obviously, they're up here. Okay, this is their actual decentralized nation, but I would assume there are still pops living here that count themselves basically as at least sympathizers, maybe just culturally related or culturally the same as the Iron Confederacy. Obviously, they don't just exist in these exact borders. As they said, they had to sort of compromise here, but I hope that at least gameplay-wise, we're looking at a situation where we still have native pops, of course, in these regions as well. But that is pretty good, or rather pretty interesting, how they made progress here and how they implemented this again in Victoria 2. I mean, empty land or owned by Mexico, Canada, or the US. So this is a big gameplay changer for sure. Even with these considerations, we still ended up pursuing a modified version of that proposal that did more to preserve the borders of larger imperial borders. We didn't want too many avenues for the United States to colonize its way into historical Canadian territories, or for Mexico to colonize its way into Minnesota. Man, wouldn't that be cool though? Right, technically, if this was connected, if Mexico, so if all of these were native countries, Mexico could technically make its way over here. That would be pretty funny. This way, the US could technically go up there, but it's not nearly as much as they could do if the Iron Confederacy was there in full, right? That's quite interesting to see, actually. I do miss the Council of Three Fires and hope I can get it back in, but that depends on getting a design hammered out that works with the considerations and limitations we just went over, right? This is the Council of Three Fires. Very interesting. Maybe we're going to see that in release. Other regions have had design considerations made in their implementation too. You can see it right here. This is New Guinea. And New Guinea has a large variety, as you can see, of different languages, and with that of different cultural circles, and all of these can't be depicted in this way. I mean, in mods they can, right? But the devs can't do that here for a reasonable approach. I'm gonna be real with you, there was no way we were going to accurately and sufficiently map out all the peoples of New Guinea. That's one region where I think we've probably done the most consolidation, but I think it was necessary in order to provide anything like the combined strength needed in order to give the indigenous peoples of New Guinea a decent punch in case of a native uprising, right? So that is what it's all about. Is there a relationship that can be formed between the colonizer and the colonized? Because if not, then why have a mechanic like that, right? You need to have the mechanic do something, and in this case you consolidate it so that the mechanic does something, and if you colonize New Guinea, you might have some resistance rather than just people that are angry but are not strong enough to revolt. Here we have yet again a screenshot of Africa, of course. If you remember, if you saw the early Victoria 3 screenshots, then you will remember that this was a largely different map. I'm pretty sure none of these except Sokoto were colored in. I could be wrong though. So none of those were centralized, but now many here are centralized and actually give you gameplay opportunities. That is pretty good. I'm looking forward to an anti-colonial Sokoto, or maybe trying your own Imperium, right? Trying to rise up above everybody else, basically just do what the Europeans would have done, except from an African angle. This is something, of course, where there is a lot of freedom in what you can do in these map games. Very interested to see what the potential of Sokoto might be. Thailand, for example, well, back in the day, Siam, right, comes to mind when it comes to a country resisting European imperialism and then joining Japanese imperialism. Also very interesting to see, but actually, I mean, I guess it's at the end of the Victoria 3 timeline, so sort of still in there. Anyway, very interesting, because now Sokoto also actually has something to play with. West Africa had many design decisions made since it was first mapped out for Victoria 3. As mentioned above, the original map built off of was Victoria 2, so the first thing done was just getting some entity everywhere on the map. Countries that were first marked as decentralized have been centralized, such as the Ashanti Empire, and tag additions and renamings are a thing that's happened already and will happen again as we continue to invest time in research and listen to feedback from our fans. I love this. I really love this. I know very little. I will tell you right now, the most that I know here about this area in particular is actually, funnily enough, you know, everything that is the CK3 time period, just because once CK3 implemented it, I actually started to read up on it, but in the Victorian period, I know very little. So I'm very interested to see what this looks like and then to dive deeper into it once we actually play the game. Remember, these are not historical education sources. These are just, hey, you first jump in, right, and then you can read up on it. Here is the Ashanti Empire. Quite interesting. Honestly, I'm gonna look that up, the Ashanti Empire. I would like to see what that is all about. Decentralized nations give life to regions that have been treated as blank slates up till now. Mapping them out, getting them right, and balancing the challenges of precision and gameplay are a constant struggle, one which we are constantly tackling and working through. The result of all of this, though, is a world that feels much more alive, one that I hope you'll be happily exploring at Victoria 3's release. Very happy about this. Ophello, Victoria 3's release. Is there something you want to tell us? Do you know something? Is there anything on your mind? I'm very interested in this, of course, but we'll see. This is an interesting dev diary, don't get me wrong here, but we are missing some big topics, man. My god, Victoria Revolutions. And you don't even want to see South America, by the way. It was so perky. It was so oddly perky, but these old colors here, that is really something, man. Looking at this yet again, the old colors for Portugal as well. This is just a real nostalgia trip for me right here. And then Victoria 2 and Victoria 3. Victoria 3 being much better than any of the other ones where you have the actual decentralized nations in there. Yeah, I'm very eager to learn whether any of this is indicative for an announcement of a game release date. I'm not sure. I personally, I know there's Team May. They're very committed to Team May, so they're saying this is going to be released in May. I don't see it. I think we're going to see August. That's my personal guess anyway. But I gotta tell you, like, I mean, obviously there's still trade to do. There's still various other topics, but we are sort of in this in-between phase. And usually when you have this in-between phase, you then might have an announcement, and then you ramp up again with, for example, heavy dev diaries like trade, maybe revisiting war, that sort of stuff. let's see, maybe they got something for us at some point going forward. I'm terrible at transitions, so let me just say that next week is Daniel Tollman's Dev Diary, and we're going to ship some monumental information here. By that I mean it's on canals and monuments, canals and monuments. All right, yep. I mean, that's going to be interesting. I would like to see what special buildings look like in Victoria 3 and how you can build a canal like the Suez and the that other one that I forgot. Panama, there you go. I'm very eager to see that, but this is this Dev Diary. As I said, light on mechanics, very interesting nonetheless. It's a different design philosophy that we have here, and it is finally a much more multi-layered design philosophy. And yeah, look at this new color of Portugal, and there you go. That's the classic Portugal. But basically, at the end of the day, this is a really good design approach. I'm very eager to see where it's going, where decentralized nations might be 2-3 years after release, right? If they want to do something with them. For the moment, let me know what you think about this Dev Diary. Let me know what you think when Victoria 3 will release. Again, I'm Team August. For now, I will see you later, alligator.